Man has always wanted to dominate and possess more than others. Since the dawn of time, many people have tried to dominate regions of the world, and even the whole world with the help of others. Over the course of several thousand years, many people emerged on our planet, dominating the surrounding region and even having the predisposition to take over the whole world. In this episode, I will present you a list of extraordinary and powerful countries that are no longer visible on the maps of the world, but formerly aroused fear in the hearts of the inhabitants of neighboring countries. Number 5. The Kingdom of Sweden. Sweden is a country in the northern part of Europe on the Scandinavian peninsula with the capital in Stockholm. Once upon a time, the Kingdom of Sweden was one of the European powers. Once the southern part of Sweden, Skåne, was part of the homeland of the Germans. In the Middle Ages, the northern and central parts of the country were inhabited by Scandinavian Norman tribes. In the 9th to 11th centuries, the Swedish Vikings took part in plundering expeditions, mainly to Kiev and Ruthenia and Byzantium. At the same time, the inhabitants of these areas formed the Swedish state, which was Christianized in the 11th century. In the 12th to 13th centuries, Sweden began its conquest of Finland. In 1397, Sweden joined the union with Denmark and Norway, and together they formed the Kalmar Union. In 1523, Gustav I made Sweden independent under the rule of the Vasa dynasty. After the Kingdom of Sweden began to fight for influence around the Baltic Sea, the kings of Sweden had plans to create Sweden's inner lake from the Baltic Sea. They planned to fight for the areas of Pomerania, Livonia, and many others. In 1527, Sweden became a country ruled by Protestantism. In the years 1592 to 1599, Sweden was associated with the Polish-Swedish Union, with the PolishLithuanian Commonwealth, but the union broke up due to the reluctance of the Swedes towards Catholic Poles and Orthodox Ruthenians. At the end of the 17th century, the conflict over Livonia began, involving Sweden, Russia, Denmark, Poland, and Lithuania. The conflict ended with the victory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Swedes captured only the northern part of Livonia. In 1635, Sweden incorporated into its territory all of Estonia and northern Livonia, which it took from Poland. These times were wonderful for Sweden, especially in the 17th century, from the reign of Gustav II Adolf, from 1611 to 1632, to Charles X Gustav, from 1654 to 1660, fighting for domination in the Baltic Sea region. Wars with Denmark, Poland, and Russia, and in the years 1630 to 1648, participation in the 30 Years' War, which led to Sweden gaining a superpower position in territorial gains. After the defeat of Charles XII in the Northern War from 1700 to 1721, most of the territorial gains were lost, mainly to Russia, and the status of a superpower was lost. After Charles's death in 1718, the so-called Era of Freedom from 1718 to 1772 arrived. That is the heyday of parliamentarianism, and the political influence of the throne decreased. During the first half of this era, two factions vied for power and influence. An important event of the era was the abolition of censorship in Sweden in 1766. The Era of Freedom ended when Gustav III restored absolute power through a coup d'etat. In 1805, Sweden joined a third anti-French coalition. The military operations of the Swedish troops were conducted in Pomerania, but were not successful. In 1808, as a result of the reckless policy of King Gustav IV Adolf, Sweden broke the truce with France and entered a war with Denmark and Russia. The consequence of this was the loss of Finland to Russia. In 1809, after the overthrow of King Gustav Adolf, Parliament adopted the first constitution in Sweden's history. In 1812, the new King Charles XIV John brought about rapprochement with Russia. Swedish troops took part in the battles with Napoleon. However, the greatest success of the new king was after the victorious war with Denmark joining Norway to Sweden. This incorporation was not a complete incorporation, but a personal union of two equal countries. Sweden at one point in its history was feared in Europe, had a powerful navy, and a strong land army. The defeat of the Kingdom of Sweden was the result of unsuccessful policies in the 18th and 19th centuries. Also near Sweden, There were almost always other powers, i.e. Russia, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire. The final collapse of the empire is seen in the loss of Finland and Sweden's declaration of neutrality. Number 4. The Kingdom of Aksum. The Kingdom of Aksum was an ancient civilization that existed from the year 80 BC to 825 AD. It was centered in northern Ethiopia and Eritrea in East Africa. Its capital was the city of Aksum. It developed thanks to trade contacts between the Arabian Peninsula and Africa, including with the Kingdom of Meroe, from which she imported among others ivory, rubber, spices, and delivered them to trade routes. From the port of Adulis, goods can be transported to the Mediterranean Sea, as well as to India and Ceylon. It experienced its peak in the 3rd to 6th centuries, and expanded its borders to the south and west and became one of the powers of the Middle East. The lord of the Aksumites was then called Nagusa Nagast, or King of Kings. In the middle of the 4th century, during the reign of Azana, Aksum adopted Christianity through Syrian merchants. At the same time, Kush gave up. The wealth of the state was evidenced by a gold coin, initially decorated with a new moon and 2 stars, and then after adopting Christianity with the image of the cross. The gold in Aksum was immensely popular, and its amounts were envied by the rulers of European countries, but they did not attack Aksum because of its position and strength. In the 20s of the 6th century, the ruler Aksum Caleb allied with the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I the Great against the Himyarites, and made 2 attempts to conquer the Arabian Peninsula around the year 570 AD. An expedition undertaken in the same year to conquer Mecca ended in the Aksum fiasco and the loss of its influence from the Arabian Peninsula to Persia. From the 7th century, the gradual decline of Aksum began, associated with the expansion of Islam and the isolation of the state by Muslims from the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean, and the occupation of the Akuma coast of the Red Sea, Dalak Island, and the Gulf of Massawa by the Arabs. Aksum finally collapsed in the 9th to 10th centuries, and a dozen smaller Muslim states were established on its territory. Currently, Aksum's heritage is Ethiopia. Number 3. The PolishLithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a federal state in Central and Eastern Europe on the Baltic Sea, which was founded in 1569 from the lands of the Crown of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, whose capital was Warsaw. The Union of Lublin of 1569 was the culmination of a long process of unifying both countries. Poland and Lithuania remained in a personal union from 1385, but due to the threat posed by Russia to Lithuania, it was decided to merge both nations into one. Immediately after concluding the union, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth took part in a war with Russia, which it won, defeating the Russian army near Pollock. It was then that Poland-Lithuania began to fight for the lands of Livonia, that is now Estonia and Latvia. Poland won this war and received all of Kurland, Livonia, and the southern part of Estonia. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a world phenomenon of tolerance. While other countries fought each other because of religion, in Poland anyone could live, such as Polish Cossacks who lived in the wild fields of Ukraine. They organized their own military expeditions to Crimea, Moldova, and even captured and burned Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. The Golden Age of Poland fell at the end of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century. During this period, the state successfully resisted the attacks of Sweden, Russia, and the Tatars. Poland was called the Granary of Europe. It was then the 3rd largest country in Europe with an area of 990,000 square kilometers. It stretched from the Oder River to Vyazma near Moscow. It is worth saying that Poland was the only country in history to accept the capital of Russia, Moscow. They did it several times, but the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth did not accept the Russians' proposal for a union with Poland due to the threat of rebellions. At the time, Poland had the best army in the world, the Hussars. The Hussars are cavalry. Their weapons are considered the best melee weapons in the world. The Polish Hussars managed to defeat the enemy several times larger, including near Kirkholm, where the Commonwealth's army of 3,600 destroyed 11,000 Swedish soldiers. From 1648 to 1657, the Khmelnytsky Uprising broke out in Ukraine. In 1654, after the Pereyaslav Treaty and the transfer of the Hetmanate to the Tsar of Moscow, there was a Russian attack on the Commonwealth, and a year later from the northeast by Sweden. and then the so-called Swedish deluge in 1655 to 1660. Foreign troops occupied 90% of the country's territory and ravaged it, and the Polish king was temporarily forced to flee to German Silesia. The Swedes were eventually pushed out of the country by the allies of the Commonwealth, Denmark, Austria, and Brandenburg. After the Hanseatic Union in 1658, the military operations in the east, which were interrupted in 1655, resumed. And after the victorious campaigns of the Polish and Lithuanian armies, the Russians were finally driven out of the Commonwealth. The state was weakened, losing Livonia and control over Ducal Prussia, as well as the Smolensk region and left Bank Ukraine with Kiev in the east to the Russian Empire. A further decline in the state's position was associated with the war with Turkey, at the beginning of which the Commonwealth lost Podolia and part of the right Bank Ukraine in 1672. At the end of the 17th century, during the reign of Jan III Sobieski, the Commonwealth once again entered into alliance with the Habsburg monarchy and joined them in the fight against the Ottoman Empire. In 1683, the Turks were defeated at Vienna, which ended their expansion into Europe. The main role in the fight was played by Polish Hussars who attacked the Turks and killed a large number of enemies. After the peace in Karlowitz in 1699, the Commonwealth regained the lands lost in 1672, but it did not take other territories. From the end of the 17th century, internal problems began to grow. A completely destabilized state surrounded by strong systems of power was an unusual phenomenon in Europe, and, as a result of intrigues, it began to enter the orbit of influence of a strong Russian monarchy. In the end, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth succumbed to its stronger neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, which in 1772, 1793, and 1795 destroyed Poland and Lithuania. Attempts were made to save the declining power from its collapse by signing the Second World Constitution in 1791 and organizing an unsuccessful uprising against the aggressors in 1794 and 1795. The legacy of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is currently Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus. Number 2. The French Empire. The French Empire is a state that existed from 1804 to 1815. During the period of the greatest territorial development, the empire encompassed various protectorates and many dependent states. France was then forced to wage war with almost all European countries because many coalitions were being formed against her. On December 2, 1804, the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, was crowned Emperor of the French at the Paris Cathedral of Notre Dame. According to legend, at the key moment of his coronation, Napoleon took a crown stylized in a Roman pattern from the hands of Pope Pius VII and put it on his head. In response to the coronation of Napoleon, the Roman-German Emperor Franz II Habsburg was crowned Emperor of Austria under the name of Francis I. A pan-European response to this act was the creation in August 1805 of the Third Anti-French Coalition. Ended with the peace in Pressburg, it gave rise to a new war which broke out with the Kingdom of Prussia the following year. After its fall in Tilsit in 1807, the Empire of Napoleon and Emperor Alexander joined the alliance, and the Russian Empire undertook to respect a trade blockade with England. At that time, however, Napoleon's intrigues over Spain sparked another war. The Fifth Anti-French Coalition was formed in 1809 when Austria attacked the Confederation of the Rhine, and thus provoked Napoleon to return from Spain. The successful start of the war and the victorious Battle of Aspern, however, did not guarantee Austria's ultimate success. A few months later, the Austrians lost the decisive Battle of Wagram. As a result, a truce was concluded in Znojmo, and then the peace treaty in Schönbrunn was signed, as a result of which France increased its territorial gain. Then Napoleon created new protectorates, including the Duchy of Warsaw, which was the basis for the war he had planned with Russia. After an unsuccessful trip to Russia in 1812 and a defeat at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, Napoleon was forced to fight in France. Despite the brilliant six-day campaign, considered by historians to be one of the best in Bonaparte's career, almost 400,000, the coalition army was heading towards Paris. The city was defended by about 50,000 soldiers under the command of Bonaparte's brother, Napoleon Joseph. The capital surrendered on March 31st, accelerating the fall of the empire. Eventually, Bonaparte signed his act of abdication on April 6, 1814, at Fontainebleau, south of Paris. Then Napoleon was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, where he stayed for 10 months. He escaped from there, however, and then tried to mobilize the declining empire to fight. However, in 1815, the Congress of Vienna took place, which initiated new changes in Europe, and Napoleon himself was exiled again, but this time to St. Helena. Number 1. The Third Reich. The Third Reich was a country in Central Europe that dominated almost all of Europe during its territorial expansion. In 1932, the NSDAP was successful in parliamentary elections and became the largest party in the Reichstag. In the same year, Hitler lost in the second round of the presidential elections to Paul von Hindenburg, but soon on January 30th, 1933, was appointed Chancellor of Germany. After Hindenburg's death on August 2, 1934, Hitler, intimidating political opponents in the opposition, prompted the Reichstag to pass a law that gave him full power. As a result of a nationwide referendum on August 19, 1934, Hitler was called the Führer, that is, the leader of Germany. All power was centralized in Hitler, and his words transcended all laws. The government was not a coordinated, cooperative body of power, but a collection of various factions fighting for Hitler's power and recognition. During the Great Depression, the Nazis managed to restore economic stability and put an end to mass unemployment through heavy military spending and a mixed economy. The economic stabilization of the state increased the popularity of the regime. Racism, especially anti-Semitism, was a central feature of the German regime. The Germanic people were mistakenly regarded by the Nazis as the purest branch of the Aryan race and thus treated as the master race. During the Holocaust, millions of Jews, Roma, Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, and other nationalities deemed undesirable by the state were murdered. Any opposition to Hitler's rule was ruthlessly suppressed. Members of the liberal, socialist, and communist opposition were killed, imprisoned, or sentenced to exile. Christian churches have also been oppressed, and many of their leaders have been imprisoned. Education focused on racial biology, demographic policy, and the development of physical fitness for later military service. In 1936, the Summer Olympic Games were organized in the Third Reich. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels was in the office of the Minister of Propaganda. He used movies, mass rallies, and Hitler's mesmerizing oratorio to control public opinion. The government controlled arts and culture, promoted certain forms of art, and prohibited or discouraged the development of others. In the early 1930s, the Third Reich began to put forward increasingly aggressive territorial claims, threatening war if they were not met. In 1938 and 39, the Reich, together with Poland and Hungary, took the territories of Austria and Czechoslovakia. However, Germany was not always as aggressive as it seemed. In 1934, Józef Pilsudski, a general who defeated the USSR in 1921, threatened Hitler with war if he came close to the border between the Free City of Gdansk and Poland. The Germans also feared problems with Hungary, who threatened that if the German foot appeared on Hungarian soil, it would be brutally taken from it. In August of 1939, Hitler signed a pact with Joseph Stalin, as a result of which, in September of the same year, Poland was attacked, starting with the Second World War in Europe. Along with Italy and the smaller Axis states, Germany conquered much of Europe, including France, Norway, and Romania, and threatened Britain. The Reich commissariats took control of the conquered territories, and the German administration was established in the infrastructure remaining in Poland. Jews and other races perceived as undesirable by the Germans were imprisoned and murdered in concentration and extermination camps that the Germans placed in today's Poland. After the German invasion of the USSR in 1941, the war slowly turned against the Nazis, who suffered major military defeats in 1943. In the following year, the large-scale bombing of Germany intensified, and Axis forces were transferred to Southeast Europe. After the Allied invasion of France, Germany was conquered by the USSR to the east and other Allied states to the west, and capitulated within a year. Hitler's refusal to admit defeat led to enormous damage to German infrastructure and additional deaths in the final months of the war. The victorious Allies initiated a policy of denazification in Germany, and many surviving Nazi leaders stood trial in the Nuremberg war crimes trials. During the war, Germany was characterized by cruelty, as a result of which at least 10 million people died as a result of the Holocaust, and about 60 million died during the entire war. The Germans in Eastern Europe killed people who protect Jews, abducted about 2 million children who they thought fit the Aryan race, and during the siege of Leningrad forced the inhabitants of this Soviet city to cannibalism, murder, and many other inhumane things. The fall of the Third Reich was caused by the stupidity of the German leader, who fell into a frenzy hearing from the front reports that were unfavorable for the Germans, as well as his inconsistency. That's it for today's episode. There have been many other powers in the world. If you want to see the next list of 5 former empires that no longer exist, leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye.